How viewing landscapes as pastoral makes working land aesthetic. Reading trees to interpret landscapes. People leave records of their goals, struggles, and environmental interactions in the landscape. This aspect of landscape functions in a communicative way and can be read and interpreted by others, albeit via their own lenses of experience. The American landscape has been slighted as a particularly incomprehensible or even boring text. Curmudgeonly popular environmental writers such as James Kunstler and Peter Blake call it placeless and complain in books such as The Geography of Nowhere and God's Own Junkyard that suburban and peri-urban landscapes particularly have too much clutter, too much change and shifting investment, and too little commitment to make good reading. The meanings that individuals experience in or attribute to the environment are often symbolic or metaphorical. Some aspect of the environment triggers an association or stands in for something else. The landscape as text provides multiple layers to read to explore what sort of stories get told about the way people live and the way they want to live. Approaching landscapes as stories in this way also reveals different perspectives that are written into landscapes. This story-oriented metaphorical perspective also opens opportunities to decide and change how to tell and participate in environmental stories, rather than just be swept along by their suggestions. Understanding experience as narrative also makes the stories and metaphors of experience themselves richer, because it helps provide a framework for viewing human activities within the context of cultural and natural history, and for drawing on what other people have done facing similar opportunities and obstacles. Recognizing the ways human experience has been woven into the environment in this way may also help people see their lives as much a part of the natural environment as in opposition to it. As a palpable part of lived experience and of landscapes that can be read, trees function symbolically in many ways. Trees provide a metonymy, an associative trope of environmental relationships. Although it's easy not to think about the everyday use of trees or other material resources from the natural environment, people tend to like trees and the green environment. They like having them around houses, especially, although perhaps not too close. Trees raise property values, raise civic loyalty, and even when they cause the need to rake, trees' color and interest are widely sought after and praised. Even where trees are not revered with Arbor Day fervor, they are valued for their fruits, nuts, and shelter from wind. Picking apples, collecting walnuts, climbing trees, and using the wood from a known tree in a building, piece of furniture, or even a fire can give satisfaction, as can appreciation of wood even from unknown or exotic trees. Trees are a central part of the cultural production of environments in many cultures, and exurbanites often represent both their cultural and environmental aspirations in arboreal terms. Aside from the more obvious celebratory tree moments such as Arbor Days or Earth Days, which many people celebrate with activities such as tree planting, always one of the easiest activities for which to elicit exurban volunteering, residents of green sprawl landscapes tend to engage in a quieter and more constant forestation. This is especially true in the exurbs. Like much of the U.S. Northeast and the eastern parts of Ontario, the farm where I spent this past weekend has been slowly reforesting around the marginal farming of the couple who grew market crops there for several decades before they retired. They held the encroachment of the forest onto their arable land at bay with crops and haying. Although he continues to grow vegetables and hay on the land, in contrast to his predecessors, the new owner has decided to help reforestation along, exemplifying a trend that explains at least some of the widespread reforestation in Exurbia. Furthermore, having moved away from the city in midlife, my friend wants to skip the too slow process of natural succession that was beginning to creep over the outer pastures, and to jump directly into having the sort of forest he has, by historical research, determined to have covered his hill pastures and swamps before they were cleared for agriculture. This is the forest nature intended as he sees it. His farm reflects a common tendency in the exurban places I have studied to express an imagination of the future and an ideology of lifestyle in terms of trees, garden plants, and other materials of nature. This use of trees to explore the natural environment and to shape it, or enable it to take its own shape depending on the perspective you're reading from, illustrates a fascination and interaction with trees that flavors much exurban land use, especially in its forested manifestation. Like many exurbanites, my friend has renamed the farm after a significant landscape feature. The Cedar Grove is both the symbolic and physical center of his reforestation project. Reforestation is as defining a feature of many exurban properties as lawns, whether through intentional projects, benevolent neglect, or just capitulation to saplings. Anyone who follows controversies over expanding metropolitan areas, or who sees mainstream media, is familiar with the common use of tree imagery in sprawl and environmental management contexts. Dramatic images of trees are often used to convey a significant meaning or purpose. In advertisements for everything from new suburbs to sports utility vehicles, again and again, the ideal life is represented as inhabiting nature, the place where trees are at home, but humans are only visiting. Amid the rising housing developments on the northern fringe of Toronto, Jefferson Forest advertises itself around its entrance on large billboards with a photograph of a family sitting in a sylvan living room with coffee table, couches, and lamps set comfortably yet incongruously in the depths of a forest much larger than any in sight and without the houses. A very rare community nestled within forest, ravines, and green space, it claims, tying ideas of home, family, and community to the instant achievement of a landscape that bears no mark of a residential presence except for furniture, which appears to have sprung up magically from the carpet of leaves. This family grove is the symbolic core of the residential forest, providing, in the curtain of trees drawing around each house, the protection and solace of home. All around the urban periphery, these real estate billboards advertise highly successful new residential developments, such as Autumn Grove, with images of an imagined residential engagement with the environment. At the edge of the built-up area, where the contrast between dense urban living and the greener countryside cannot be missed, these signs tell a convincing story of a wondrous natural landscape to be explored. Explore a magnificent new landscape for living. Detached homes in a wondrous natural paradise. Up close and personal with nature. Depicting the geographical imagination projected over the reproduction of suburban landscapes, the billboards cannot be interpreted without the context of escape from the city, but they also present the landscape at the city's edge in terms of its potential for encounter with nature. This potential is often represented in their iconography and language by trees. Across the street from each other, Autumn Grove and Jefferson Forest are advertised almost entirely in terms of the encounter with nature and trees they offer. Jefferson Forest's description of its constructed aspects are always accompanied by promises of everyday engagement with the forest and with the ideals this forest represents. Welcome home through a grand entrance flanked by majestic pines, bordering on acres of established forest, acres of green space, just a short walk from every home. These signs may point to some of the cultural tropes of the modern pastoral, and the way they are reproduced through the imagery of trees that help explain how many aspects of exurban forests and the social relations they represent are much more about the imaginary landscape ideals promoted to residents than about the trees themselves. The mythology of nature symbolism, imagining wilderness and immortality. Epigraph. Big, craggy, thick-boled, they crowded the steep hillside like some dark enchantment, the sunlight filtering furtively through their crowns as if afraid to be caught touching the ground. Sleeping beauty trees, Rumpelstiltskin trees. Forests are not ancient, they are new, every one of them, at every instant, always being born, always dying, always changing. Ancient is for ruins and artifacts. What we have here is life. William Ashworth, The Left Hand of Eden. Although they may appear in more prosaic form than the mythological dramatization of trees invoked in the above epigraph relating to struggles over forestry and forest protection during the spotted owl controversies of the 1990s, the problems of reconciling environmental imagination with experience are a recurrent theme when exurban residents discuss what they do with their yards and gardens. The journalist A.C. Spektorsky used the term exurbanite in 1955 to describe a phenomenon he saw as a limited dream. Convinced that New York advertising executives were selling residential nature to themselves through their advertisements, Spektorsky illustrated his view of their unfounded expectation in the climax anecdote of his book, The Exurbanites. After planting hundreds of apple trees with his fleet of new machinery, but still not finding happiness or satisfaction on his new Connecticut exurban estate, a member of an applesauce marketing team realizes that he has been duped by his own advertisement into a fruitless quest for meaning in nature and a long commute. Long-term studies of classic exurban communities in scenic rural places support this view of the limited dream of transformative personal experience in unmediated natural settings as a false expectation, or an attempt to inhabit an imagined landscape. How is it that trees in nature so encourage or mislead this imagination? Talking to exurbanites who describe themselves as having slipped the clutches of urban modernity has given me the opportunity to consider what trees encourage in the exurban imagination, and how this imagination of trees leaves a gap between sought-after landscape experiences and the experiences exurbanites tend to have. In interviews with hundreds of residents of the exurban fringes of Toronto, New England, and Christchurch, I asked specifically about the details of what they do with their residential landscapes. Near Toronto, for example, well over half had planted trees extensively on their properties. Almost all had planted or cultivated their trees in some way, and many bought properties specifically because they had already been planted with trees. This pattern was similar in New England, where several participants in the cases I researched had engaged in maintaining forests not only on their own properties, but also on adjacent ones, through planting, conservation easements, and outright purchase of trees so that they would remain standing. And in Christchurch, where much afforestation was associated with native species restoration. People consistently described moving beyond the built-up areas because it was more natural out there, and described forestation as one of the central identifiers of the exurban landscape, fulfilling both the physical and imaginative expectations of connection with nature. In these areas I've studied, the forest defines the archetypal landscape difference between exurbs and suburbs. Even where housing densities may be comparable, the exurban landscape aesthetic includes forest encouraged to grow up between the houses to provide the setting for the imagined good life. These exurbs fan out beyond the suburban landscape where houses sit in a matrix of lawns to a more closed landscape in which houses and their lawns are islands in a matrix of trees. This new succession of the residential forest has to do with the symbolic as much as the physical characteristics of trees. Large and solid, trees embody a tangible and tractable nature that is, at the same time, gratifyingly beyond obvious human control. Trees suggest the potential presence of nature anywhere. Dig a hole with dirt in it, and you can have a tree. Trees live for a long time. They screen views over which people have no other control. Trees create a space around them, even when they are trimmed and constrained, that reads palpably as a place of nature. And enough trees together read as a significantly natural place. Trees invoke a genius of a place that feels as if it transcends human making. This transcendent quality of nature is used, however, to build a relationship with the natural environment that reflects pleasing aspects of environmental experience and evades aversive aspects. Such uses construct an image of nature that reflects wishful fantasy. The goals inscribed into this forested residential landscape of Exurbia, the meanings woven between houses into the matrix of trees and gardens, show an ideal of nature informing the imagination from which the exurban landscape has been brought forth. Shaping a place as much of the mind as anywhere else, exurbanites use trees to make a place where expectations of connection to nature are translated into the landscape. Despite its potential for engagement in local and more abstract environmental issues, the ideal of redemptive, reforesting nature into which residents can plunge their efforts, and from which they might extract modest realizations of utopian dreams, tends toward a view of nature that is stable, static, and although exploratory, also escapist. It is common for residents to launch into a description of their landscape management with the assurance that they would not cut down trees, unless under dire duress. Many residents don't wish to balk the values they associate with exurban living that are represented by the stewardship of trees, or the sense that non-interference with trees means good environmental behavior. Around Christchurch, where landscapes have been spectacularly deforested for agricultural uses, exurbanites often equated the regeneration of native or imported forests as redemptive acts making up for the errors of colonization and ecological imperialism. In the Toronto exurbs, residents discussed their efforts at saving, preserving, and not cutting down even sick trees or trees that were in the way of other goals for their properties, such as gardens, play spaces, or house additions. This restraint vis-a-vis embodied nature testifies strikingly to the symbolic power these trees possess, especially as the forests in which these houses were situated were young, and in many cases had been reforesting only since the houses had been built on agricultural lands well into the post-war era. Through my research in Exurbia, I've seen how ordinary interactions with trees can help shed light on the challenges involved in understanding the environment and interacting with it. Trees provide a clear example of expectations of the natural environment, and the failure of those expectations, in all their utopian glory, and also in all their mortal failure. Despite the fact that residents don't want to cut the trees down, many feel somewhat chagrined about the way the trees have turned out. The house is too dark, the lawn and garden aren't growing under the trees, the driveway is becoming impassable. Even residents with reforestation projects, however, despite being impressed by the rapidity of growth and change they observed, often cling securely to an image of the final product, the future climax forest toward which they're working, rather than thinking of their forest in terms of process. This climax forest reflects the kind of grand immortal idea of nature I've described. Inspired by the rugged landscapes of Ontario's cottage country, many residents have planted conifers to replace their southern Ontario deciduous forests, and especially to replace its weedy and short-lived species which don't fit the forest image these residents would like. These struggles to negotiate how the yard amidst nature should look and function emphasize the difficulties faced by residents in figuring out what they would like to do with their environments. In these yards, which epitomize the exurban dream, trees are both the most volumetrically and aesthetically abundant representative of nature, and also a salient moral force for residents. Exploring what the trees mean to exurban residents helps in understanding how interactions with trees represent, in some ways, broader environmental aspirations. Trees not only grow and add green to everything, sucking up carbon dioxide, relieving suburban ennui, and materializing imaginations of the ideal life and the past, but they also die, not only if humans cut them down to use them or pollute them to death, but just on their own, as an attribute of being a living thing. Trees both exhibit and symbolize the larger dynamic of nature of which they are a part. By showing the effects of climate, pollution, soil, insect, and water regimes, trees bring attention to socio-environmental dynamics. And when people become involved in managing or championing trees provide a set of tangible icons and issues through which to investigate these socio-environmental dynamics. Trees provide something to champion and a chance to reflect on how and why such championing takes place. Stories of why and how people revere trees, but also find them difficult, show the combination of a fascination with, but also an uncritical glorification of an ideal of nature, especially of a nature that doesn't change and doesn't have problems. When exurban residents describe their concerns about the environment, and also their aspirations for their own residential environments, many tend to attribute most good things to nature and bad things to people. Their land use activities and descriptions follow these characterizations. Many residents overlook the human aspects of cultural reforestation, stewardship efforts, and the human changes to their properties, attributing them instead to natural agency, what nature is meant to do. Despite this automatic respect for natural agency, an active interest in native vegetation and natural regeneration, many of these same residents vigorously oppose manifestations of natural succession, such as the appearance of poplars, which, as species of early succession, are weedy and unpleasantly short-lived. Weediness and short lifespan in a tree seem to chafe at a deeply held attitude about nature, which I have come to think of through these interviews as a sense not only of nature's independence from people, but of its enduring immortality, or at least perfection, a conception of nature that fits in very well with a sense of wild nature, or wilderness, a sense of nature as being greater than, older than, and in fact, better off without people.